Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
There's no specific training about techniques of listening. I never received any such training, but it was regarded as something intuitive. I've never been asked questions before now, about listening. Never. No one's asked me questions about that. And therefore I'm trying to respond against a background of many years of professional life in which listening has been a very important part to my life, but techniques of listening were not taught. That was just the way I wanted to see the whole picture, because one of the problems in the law is getting transfixed with a particular text, either of an act of Parliament or of a judicial opinion, and then forgetting the context of that text in the larger picture. And context is extremely important for meaning and for understanding what the law is correctly understood. It was listening, but it wasn't listening with a pure heart. This was listening in order to gain their votes for my advancement in the world of student politics. And as the Chief Justice of New South Wales said on my departure from the Supreme Court, I was a juggernaut of student politics, and that was because I listened and responded to the interests of those who were the voters for the attainments that I longed for. During my judicial years, I would normally start at about 5 o'clock when there was no telephone and no interruption, and I could read up the material for the case of the day. And that is not listening, except you're listening to the inner voice, reading the materials and getting the information into your head.
In this episode of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, we travel to the High Court of Australia to learn from former Justice Michael Kirby. We explore with him how methodical listening helped him during his time in student politics, and also helped him while preparing and listening to the most significant and complex cases in the highest court of the land. Listen out for the role his parents, and particularly his father, played in developing listening muscles through storytelling. I love the way the Justice talked about the role of visual techniques in aiding him during listening for extended periods of time in dealing with a wide range of matters. One of the things I loved exploring was listening how during court cases he would visualise a jigsaw puzzle that he was bringing together slowly but surely, methodically and deliberately. And then finally, take the time to understand how you listen through cultures and societies. When the Justice and commissioners from Indonesia and Serbia take testimony from refugees from North Korea. Let's listen to Justice Kirby.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, the book, is available via Amazon or at oscartrimboli.com/books. It's organised in a really practical way around the 5 levels of listening. Whether I speak on stage or listeners who email me after listening to the podcast, the most common question is, what's the most practical tip I can give somebody to improve their listening? And it always starts with level 1, listen to yourself. How do you prepare yourself so that you can listen to somebody else in the dialogue? And the deeper that you breathe, the deeper you listen. Check out the book, Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, and you'll be able to move from an unconscious listener to a deep and powerful listener.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
Growing up around the family dinner table, I'm curious what the conversation would have been about, and who do you feel was the best listener in the group?
First of all, we did have a dinner together every night virtually, and that we was my father, my mother, my brother Donald, my brother David, and my sister Diana. So we were 6. And having that conversation was definitely a wonderful thing in our lives. And I feel very sorry for the modern generation who live in their mobile phones and don't really communicate as much as people did in my time. What were the subjects? It was everything. It was about our schooling. Our parents were supportive but not oppressive. They were happy when we did well, but they didn't blame us when we didn't do well. Normally, we did well, and therefore the conversation was encouragement, pride in achievement, and interest in what we were learning, and participation. I was never a good speller. My mother would help me with spelling. She was a wonderful speller, and I got better at it. But my father was very interested in history, and so a lot of time was talking about history, usually British imperial history, and he had a great knowledge of it and would pass that knowledge on to us. He was a great reader to us. Our parents were wonderful parents. They were young parents. They were wonderful parents. And as to who was the best listener, I think it was possibly my mother, because she had a rather more self-effacing attitude. Perhaps this was a feature of women in those times. We're talking about the 1940s and 50s. My father was a bit of a show-off. I'm more like my father. My mother had very good judgment of character, and that may have come from the fact that she spent more time listening and not showing off and not speaking before she thought. But she had very good perception, and my father had very good display. And between the two of them, they gave us gifts of communication, which are invaluable if you're going to the occupation of an advocate and a judge.
Your father was a great reader and read to you often. To what extent do you think that helped you in developing listening muscles?
I think it helped in storytelling, and that is basically what my father did. He read particular books to us. We never got the Magic Pudding or Australian stories for children. We got the Grimm's fairy stories, and they were German stories, which were written down by the brothers Grimm, and they were not the idea of the brothers Grimm. They simply collected these traditional stories and recorded them, and then they were translated into English. They were very didactic stories. And one lesson that my father repeatedly read to us was of a person who had a wife named Alice. Alice, my wife, the plague of my life, has sent me to beg a boon of thee. And Alice would send her fisherman husband to a source of power, and she was elevated from a housewife in a hut with the fisherman to the local squire, and then to the local baron, and then to the local lord, and then to the king, and then to the emperor, and then to the pope. And then when she wanted to be God, she was sent back to the fisherman's hut. And that was a story designed to tell the listener of not overreaching yourself or not being greedy, I suppose. So we listened to my father's story. My father had a very good voice, and I inherited my father's voice. I spent a lot of time listening to him, and he knew a lot about history, mainly British imperial history, wars, kings, and sacrifice, and all of that he would tell us, and we would sit there with eyes wide open listening to him. And in his presence, we had to listen. We were not there to be interrupting.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
깊은 듣기.
Deep listening.
A successful school time led to entrance into university, and you explored leadership roles in the student council. I'm curious what you learn about listening to all diverse groups through the university as a leader on the student council at Sydney University.
I'd love to say that they were diverse. They were diverse in the sense that there were women amongst them, and my schooling in high school had been in a boys-only high school at that time. So that was something different and diverse, but it wasn't as diverse as Australia was becoming in racial terms, and it was actually rather monochrome, and my schools were rather monochrome. When I go to my schools now, they're not monochrome. They are public schools in New South Wales, and I'm sure elsewhere in the Commonwealth, maybe less so in Tasmania, but they are very diverse, and they include people from many races, and that would be a good opportunity to listen to their stories and to their family histories, which would be quite different from those of my family living in the western suburb of Sydney, who were Anglo-Celtic and therefore part of the then norm of Australian society. So I can't really say that I had to listen in order to adjust to the different stories that my colleagues in student politics would bring to the table. But I did have to listen if I wanted to be successful in climbing up the greasy pole of political achievement amongst the Students' Representative Council and the Sydney University Union and the other bodies. And I did want to succeed there, and I did succeed there. I became president of the University SRC and the president of the union and so on. But my purpose of listening was to hear what other people were obsessed with, what they were banging on about, so that I could then indicate my interest in and support of their concerns in order both to do something about those concerns, if that was justified, but also to gain their respect, support, affection. And that's what I did. It was a rather methodical listening. I was listening in order to respond. I think a good politician has to listen to people in order to be able to respond to people. And one of the problems today may be that people are not listening as much as they did in my time. But my job as a student politician was to listen in order to respond to the interests of my colleagues.
You mentioned you were methodical in your listening. What structures or processes did you set up to be methodical in your listening?
I would look at the policy statements of the candidates for student positions. I would see what they were indicating was their areas of interest. I would make notes of that in order that I didn't overlook that X, the representative of medical students, was interested in this or that. And so I would engage X in conversation about this or that and bring in the issues that they had written down as of their interest. So it was listening, but it wasn't listening with a pure heart. This was listening in order to gain their votes for my advancement in the world of student politics. And as the Chief Justice of New South Wales said on my departure from the Supreme Court, I was a juggernaut of student politics, and that was because I listened and responded to the interests of those who were the voters for the attainments that I longed for.
I'm curious to test a hypothesis that I haven't been able to validate, that when you go through training as a lawyer or a judge, you receive no guidance in how to listen. Is that hypothesis valid?
Certainly there's no instruction on how to listen or what to listen out for, or how to listen as distinct from sitting and being present whilst things are happening around you. But the job of a lawyer and of a judge involves working out puzzles and getting the information to do that job involves listening and getting the essential information that is necessary, cutting away the information that is not essential and trying to ascertain the essential facts, and then to ascertain the essential rules or principles of law to be applied to the facts, and then coming to the conclusion as to what the lawful outcome is. And there's no specific training about techniques of listening. Certainly I never received any such training, but it was regarded as something intuitive. I've never been asked questions before now, about listening. Never. No one's asked me questions about that. And therefore I'm trying to respond against a background of many years of professional life in which listening has been a very important part to my life, but techniques of listening were not taught. That was simply regarded as implicit in the task of gathering up the data that was essential to the decision-making activities that I was engaged in, either as a solicitor, a clerk, a barrister, or a judge.
You said the law is about using a jigsaw puzzle to find the essentials of the truth through the overlay of the law of the land. Are you a person that builds the edges of the jigsaw puzzle while listening, or you kind of start from the big shapes in the center when you listen?
Well, I don't think anybody would have a single technique of listening. Some judges take copious handwritten notes whilst they're listening to a case. Some judges take very few notes or very short notes. I started as a judge who took very copious notes. That was what I had learned when I was a student at university. I would take very detailed notes of what the lecturers had said. And then after that, my task was to rewrite the notes in a more neat and readable form. In the law faculty, I shared the responsibility of taking notes and recording the notes and updating them and inserting cases or statutory provisions that illustrated the points, I shared that task with Murray Gleeson, who later became the Chief Justice of Australia. Our careers went in parallel to a large extent, and we worked with slightly different techniques. When I was actually preparing for exams, I sought to build tree diagrams with the major value or issue, and then the minor values, and then the sub-minor values and the sub-sub-minor values, in order that I could look at a page and see the whole page and see the sub-principles that I was trying to get into my head. When I became a judge, I started by taking copious notes and then marking on the side of them. But because in the courts in which I sat, you got a daily transcript, it was really a bit of a waste of time for me to be taking such copious notes, except to the extent that doing so helped to get information into my brain, so that somehow there was a connection between my fingers, which were holding the fountain pen or ballpoint, and the writing of it to go up my brain and up into my cortex and into my memory. So that was how I originally did it. Later, towards the end of my time, when I was on the High Court of Australia, I went back to the tree diagram, and in one of the books that's been written on my life, there is actually a photograph which shows one of those tree diagrams. And subsequently I found that there were some authors of tutorial books for students who presented legal studies in tree diagrams. The whole book was in a tree diagram. I didn't know that when I developed my technique, but that was just the way I wanted to see the whole picture, because one of the problems in the law is getting transfixed with a particular text, either of an Act of Parliament or of a judicial opinion, and then forgetting the context of that text in the larger picture. And context is extremely important for meaning and for understanding what the law is correctly understood. So that is something I achieved, I think, by this technique of the tree diagram. And when I, in later years, took notes in the case, I was trying to make a tree diagram of the arguments for and against the propositions that had to be resolved by me as a judge. That was the way I did it.
When we think about the length of time you would need to sit as a judge in judgment, for those of us who haven't been in a courtroom, how long are you actually sitting in a room listening to these submissions for, and how do you stay focused during that period of time? Because there must be all sorts of distractions that come into your mind while you're listening to these submissions.
Life is full of distractions, whereas in the role of a judge, at least at the time I was a judge, it was life was organised so that you could concentrate. I always started every day very early, and during my judicial years, I would normally start at about 5 o'clock when there was no telephone and no interruption, and I could read up the material for the case of the day. And that is not listening, except you're listening to the inner voice, reading the materials and getting the information into your head. And then you are required to sit on a full day from 10 o'clock or 10:15 until effectively 4:15 at the end of the day, with a lunch hour in the middle of it. Very concentrated attention to detail. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be in that job. It's a job that requires concentrated attention. And not everybody likes doing that, because most people love to have interruptions and stimuli and different thoughts, and maybe in some ways for the most creative writing you need stimuli and external thoughts coming into your mind. Nowadays they pop into your computer and there it is. You've got to just live with and adapt to that. But in my day, a judge didn't have those interruptions, and the judge was in charge of what interruptions he or she would tolerate.
If we come to your most recent significant work with the United Nations, the listening jigsaw puzzle on which you had to work was very different. There's 26,000 people who've left North Korea, and you've interviewed a couple of hundred of them for the work you've done for the United Nations. I'm curious, with so many layers of listening over culture, I'm assuming you needed to listen through interpreters for testimony. What was the method you used to set up a successful inquiry into the work you did with North Korea?
It wasn't all that different from the work of sitting in court, and to the extent that it had been done differently by others, I, against the background of my experience as a judge in an Australian court, was able to persuade my colleagues that we should do it substantially in the way that inquiries are conducted in Australia, or court cases are conducted in Australia, by having public hearings, by having witnesses giving testimony, by having a transcript prepared, by, in this case, having the testimony filmed and put online. So all of this was familiar territory with me, and in truth, a lot of the evidence was gruesome to an extent that you would not see it in an ordinary day in an Australian court, or even an extraordinary day. Testimony by a person who was put in a detention camp for political enemies or suspected political enemies of the regime in North Korea, and whose job it was after each day to pick up the bodies that had been thrown out from the huts of the camps because the person had died, usually from lack of food, overnight, and then put them in a wheelbarrow and take them to a vat, reduce them to ashes, and then distribute the ashes on a field nearby. All of this reminded me very vividly of the films that I had seen as a boy and a youth of the concentration camps of the Nazis, which were discovered at the end of the Second World War. And many of the stories that were recounted in their evidence by the witnesses were extremely harrowing and most upsetting, and on 3 occasions reduced me to tears because they were just so cruel. And to think that at the end of my life as an Australian judge, I was required to undertake an investigation which took me into gruesome facts was certainly unexpected encounter for me. But of course, it meant that the testimony was very vivid and not difficult to listen to or to remember, because it was just out of the ordinary course of the life of an Australian, including an Australian judge. But that was how we went about it. Although it's true there were about ultimately 30,000 refugees from North Korea in South Korea, we didn't interview anything like that number, and we had to cut off our testimony at a certain point because we just had enough, and we had to get our report written. You have to be quite efficient about these things. You can't just sit there thinking, this is such an interesting matter, I could spend months thinking about it. Well, we didn't have months. We had to get our report done effectively in 7 months, and that's what we did. That concentrates the mind, and it also concentrates the listening and the attention to detail. Detail is critical in formal decision-making, whether it's in an Australian court or in a UN inquiry. Detail, the devil is in the detail, and the outcome lies in a synthesis and analysis and then assessment of the detail of the material you've received, preferably done whilst it is fresh in your mind. And that therefore requires techniques and aids that will help you to focus on the matters you have to decide and do so efficiently. You've got to be efficient to be a judge. You can't just sit there and enjoy it.
And just finally, I'm curious about the role the commissioners from Indonesia and Serbia played in bringing a different perspective to listening in that inquiry. What perspective do you think was additive from Indonesia and Serbia?
Well, they took a very active part in the inquiry. We did agree amongst ourselves that where a woman was the witness, we would ask Sonja Veserko from Serbia to take that woman through her testimony, lest a white male authority figure distort the testimony because of some respect or deference that was exhibited to me. And the different perspectives were quite interesting, actually. Sonja Veserko, who had been a member of civil society in Serbia and had been involved in the response to the genocide that had occurred in the end of the former Yugoslavia, she looked at the big picture of what was being recounted against the background of her concern in a society which had been a communist society which collapsed and broke down, and seeing how North Korea was going to need help to get through and out of this predicament. So she was looking at that particular angle. Marzuki Darusman had been the Prosecutor General and Attorney General of Indonesia. And so he had worked in a civil law discipline, but substantially on criminal cases. And he had been an advocate and a person who prosecuted people for crimes. And therefore, he looked at it very much as a prosecutor would, looking for who is guilty of these heinous offences. And that was the angle that he brought. And he would question the witnesses in a rather more robust way than I did. I always questioned them in the manner, what we call in the courts, of examination in chief. What happened then? What did you do then? And what did you see? Letting them tell the story in their own words. He cross-examined them if there was a need to clarify something, or if he didn't really believe what was being said. He would be quite sharp. And between us all, we each contributed to the type of examination and the eliciting of the information that was necessary. But then we had to put an analysis of it and a synthesis and conclusions and recommendations and findings down on paper, because you can't just sit there thinking about it, you have to reach a conclusion and write it so that it can be presented, in this case, to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And that's what we did. We had the help of an excellent secretariat of mainly youngish, mainly legal experts who worked with us and under our direction. But the responsibility for the decisions was ours, and we discussed various points on which there was a potential of disagreement. In the end, we didn't have any disagreement. We agreed on the conclusions, we agreed on the findings, and we agreed on the recommendations. And we delivered the report, and I took great pains because I was the only native English speaker. So I took pains to weigh every word of the text to make sure it was readable. Many UN reports are not readable. Often that's because they've been written by a person whose first language is not English. But I think our report was extremely readable, and I think that was part of the reason for its success and for the impact that it made in the United Nations system. But it did require a lot of concentration on detail. My whole life has been dealing with masses of detail, masses of information, digesting it and then writing it up, then moving on to the next case. And in our system in Australia, the judge will one day be dealing with a case concerning a motor car accident, and another next day dealing with a broken contract, next day dealing with a family law case where the parties who began in love now hate each other and are fighting over the children, and dealing with a case involving a big business deal which has come unstuck. So you've got to be an instant expert in the law and the facts relevant to cases, but unless you do your decision quickly, it just becomes oppressive. And there are judges who don't have the inclination or talent or discipline to decide matters quickly, and they get a backlog of undecided cases, and it's just it's a terrible burden for them. I still have a nightmare, and even though it's now nearly 10 years since I left judicial office and the High Court, I sometimes wake up with it, sweating. It is of owing a decision that I've heard of, a case that I've heard but haven't yet delivered my reasons, and the other judges are waiting for me, and I'm holding up the whole works. In truth, I didn't often do that. In truth, I was generally the first or the second who got my decision in. But it's a sign of how deeply embedded in me there was a sense of responsibility, a sense of duty and obligation, a sense of self-pride that I was not causing the others to be inconvenienced by the fact that I was holding up the other judges and the decision of the court. And although when I wake up I know, phew, all your cases are in. They've all been done. You've delivered them all. You were on time. You did your duty. But it does show how that was very deeply embedded in my mind. And it comes from being taught the Grimm's fairy stories by my father of not getting too big for your boots, remembering your place in society, remembering your duty to fulfill your obligations, and doing your functions in a way that is expected of you. That's what most judges try to do, and that's what I tried to do.
Justice, the detail that we can't escape is we're out of time. Thank you so much. It's been enlightening, and I'm delighted that our story came full circle and we finished where we started, with your father reading the stories to us.
Yes, fathers in the audience should beware. Years and years later, their child will be telling of the impact of those stories on their lives. But overwhelmingly, with loving parents, it's a beneficial impact, and that was substantially the case in my life.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Bene ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
The art of listening seems like a simple concept, yet a skill often neglected by time-poor executives all over the world. New technologies and multitasking has paved the way to a modern world full of distractions. Oscar's book, Deep Listening, is an invaluable weapon for business leaders like yourself who are looking for more powerful ways to communicate with key talent. By reading this book, you will not only learn how to create trust and authentic actions from those around you, but also all the crucial information you need for future business success.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Kuyingisela swinene.
Kukai kikitori.
Deep listening.
If you're enjoying the series, the best way to stay up to date is to subscribe via your favourite podcast application, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and now available on Amazon Alexa. We'd love to hear your feedback as well. We're always listening for ways to improve the show. So please leave a review on your favourite podcast application as well. You know we'll be listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Kuyingisela swinene.
Kukai kikitori.
Deep listening.
I've been looking forward to this interview for quite a while, and one of the big takeouts for me was the importance of focus, discipline, presence. Focus and presence are two of the significant elements of the Chinese character Ting, which means to listen, and Ting is six-dimensional. I admire the discipline that the justice showed in turning up to his chambers every morning at 5 a.m. to prepare. I loved how he created a deliberate listening environment for him, whether it was in preparation, making sure he was completely free of distractions, and the process and the time-honoured traditions in the courtroom to ensure that there were no distractions, so focused judgment could be dispensed when the judge was hearing the matters in front of him. I was really curious about the North Korean inquiry and the fact that they took depositions from nearly 300 refugees from North Korea. And I was fascinated by the role of Sonia Bezerko, one of the three commissioners with the Justice and a member from Indonesia, about how she really was listening for the long term. She was listening for evidence of context in a post-communist society in North Korea, a truly great example of listening across all 5 levels of listening, but also listening beyond her own generation and seeing a future of possibilities for the people of North Korea. The one thing I'll do as a result of listening to this interview with the Justice and also reading the book Deep Work by Cal Newport is that I'm very much more conscious, more deliberate about creating an environment around me for listening that's free of distractions. How choiceful are you about setting up a listening environment prior to the conversation? Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lord Lassalle.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo pohonu.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.